Hello, and welcome to the Murder Media Podcast, where we analyse and overthink true crime content. I am your host, Dr. Stella Marie Gaynor. Do follow the Murder Media Project over on Instagram, Facebook and Twitter, I'm not calling it X, at murdermedia81, that's the numbers 81, or email me directly at murdermedia81@gmail.com, and you can find all episodes linked on the WordPress site and Podbean. Right then, thank you so much for listening to the first episode. Who the hell is your host? I am Dr. Stella Marie Gaynor, and I'm a senior lecturer in media, culture and communication at Liverpool John Moores University. I'm an academic, researcher, lecturer, and I love my horror, my grim history, and of course, my true crime. Before this project, my research was focused on TV horror in the United States. A moderate to severe obsession with The Walking Dead drove my PhD, and then later my first monograph, Rethinking Horror in the New Economies of Television, which I published with Palgrave MacMillan, and I'll link that in the show notes. But after spending 3 years on my PhD, which focused on TV horror, and then writing a book about TV horror, I found that when I was not watching TV horror for the book, or writing, drafting, editing, or crying about the book, I was watching less horror, well, less fictional horror anyway, and I was watching more true crime, serial killery, murdery, death culty based stuff. Now, this was around 2020, 2021, when here in the UK we were in and out of lockdown, mainly. Cluster watching or binge watching series on streaming services saw some content become almost mandatory viewing during that time. If you remember, think back to when everyone was making banana bread and watching Tiger King, Murder at the Cecil Hotel, Don't Fuck with Cats, American Murder Next Door. You remember what happened. During the height of the pandemic, to stave off going completely insane, I went for lots of walks around my local area. Every day I went for a walk, and every day I listened to a true crime podcast to keep me company. My viewing and listening habits were changing, and because I'm a media academic, I started asking questions. What was all this crime stuff that I was engaging with? Why did it seem to be having a bit of a moment across all kinds of media? Big legacy media were making documentaries and films and TV series, and then self-startup or user-generated media was producing this content that was approaching these well-worn and well-known stories of murder, but from completely new angles, from new perspectives. Podcasts, for instance, were using comedy. YouTubers were putting makeup on at the same time as telling grisly stories. And then in the last 2 to 3 years, premium television channels and streaming services were developing these glossy, expensive serializations of true crime stories. So Hulu made a series called The Act, which retells the story of Gypsy Rose and Dee Dee Blanchard. Netflix makes the Dharma Monster series that was created by Ryan Murphy. HBO made The Staircase, which is a dramatisation of, The Staircase. In the UK, ITV made Des with David Tennant, and The Long Shadow, also by ITV, covers the Yorkshire Ripper case. Now, The Long Shadow joins a collection of true crime content that re-narrativises these well-known serial killer stories by shifting the focus. So rather than telling the killer's story again, where did he grow up? How did he get to this point? Some of the contemporary crime content tells the story from a different perspective. And in this perspective, we're asking, who were the victims? Who were they before they became a name on a list? Before they became a picture on an incident room wall? An example from America, Falling for a Killer, is a documentary made by Trish Wood for Amazon. And there she talks to Liz Kendall, and she was a long-time girlfriend of Ted Bundy, and Trish Wood talks to the friends and families of those women that were murdered. Now, this documentary, Falling for a Killer, tells us about these women as people, and that's what's really important. What were they like? What did they want from life? And how has their loss impacted the very real lives of those that loved them? So rather than poring over crime scene photographs in what Stella Brusi calls evidence verite, Falling for a Killer instead presents an emotional verite, as family photographs and archived videos of these women when they were alive is examined in the same rich detail. Stories like that of Bundy, Sutcliffe and Dahmer, they're really well known, we all know what they did. But they've been told and retold over and over again for decades now in documentary, film, TV series, podcast, YouTube content and graphic novels and comics. And it's these stories or these retellings that the Murder Media Project is investigating. The Murder Media Podcast, then, we're going to explore and analyse true crime content with really detailed analysis of the narratives, the production practices, the genre conventions and how crime cases track across media. We'll also be reviewing murder media content and generally chatting about the landscape of true crime across produced and participatory media. Let's start at the beginning then. Where does all this murder media content come from? True crime might have seen an explosion in popularity or even acceptance, I suppose, in recent years, but true crime is nothing new. You do see lots of sort of misdirected articles that ask, why true crime now? Why is it so popular now? And it's like, well, it always has been. It's just, I don't know, there's just more media now, isn't there? Now, Scott C.A. argued in his 2009 book, Hanging Between Heaven and Earth, that public execution sermons in the 17th and 18th century in the UK and in the early USA can be considered true crime narratives. The condemned prisoner would be present as the sermon was read to the crowd, sometimes from the church. So you'd get the prisoner who was condemned to death, they'd be paraded in front of the crowd, and there always was a crowd because people loved a public execution, and a sermon would be read out that explains to the crowd what they've done, why they're here, and how they got to that point. So these sermons would focus on the smaller sins that led up to the bigger sin of murder for which the condemned was being executed. So all those little things that a person might do in the build-up to eventually becoming a murderer. Now the sermons were used to create an empathy for the criminal and the problems in their life that brought them to this point. How could a person possibly get to the point where they commit murder? What happened in their childhood? How were they brought up? Is this sounding familiar? Later then, after the industrialisation of the United States, these execution sermons became cheaply sold prints, which developed into crime books. So maybe you couldn't make it down to the public execution that day. You could read about it after, though, as the sermons became printed. The 19th century in the US saw a crime wave. Now, how much of a crime wave this crime wave was, or how much of it was kind of exaggerated, I guess, for the press, I'm not really sure. But a crime wave there was, and this led to a public interest in the justice system. And this popularised police magazines. These magazines featured crime stories alongside racy photos of women and sports reporting. When they say racy, I think they mean exploitative, but anyway. In the early 20th century, the Police Gazette launched, published by Bernard Macfadden. Now, according to Ian Punnett, Macfadden published many magazines. He was an early health food enthusiast and he was a keen bodybuilder. And I kind of like him for this. He frequently put himself on the front of his muscle magazines, which is, fair enough. But you can just imagine what this guy would have been like in the age of social media, and you can bet he would have had a podcast as well. Punnett goes on to trace the development of true crime via Macfadden's publication of True Detective Mysteries magazine. You've probably heard of that one. It was a kind of hybrid between the police gazettes and the whodunit detective fiction rags. Later becoming just True Detective, the magazine peddled the more salacious elements of true crime. Now, Ted Bundy himself, in his final interview, said that these magazines were like how-to guides for budding murderers. When he was blaming pornography for his years-long killing spree of women that he chose to do, that he could have stopped any time. Oh no, it wasn't his fault, it was the magazines. Now don't worry, I'll be eviscerating Bundy and the recent conversations with the killer, the Ted Bundy tapes, in a future episode of this series. This is only a little scratch at the surface of the history and development of true crime. I urge you to go and read Ian Punnett's book, Toward a Theory of True Crime Narratives, for more detail and expansion on this. Many scholars like Jean Murley, Tanya Horek, Ian Punnett, David Schmid, Mark Seltzer and myself have all noted the controversial, shall we say, nature of true crime. The genre has been dismissed and ignored by critics, considered as just lurid criminal stories that are sold as cheap entertainment. True crime has always been viewed as sensational and emotionally charged. Now, there is some truth to that, and I would agree that it can be sensational and it is emotionally charged and it can get pretty lurid at times, but it's more complex than that. True crime is a multi-platform genre, defined in its association with murder narratives, and, says Punnett, shares some common ancestral heritage with journalism, but has always been driven by different impulses. Murley defines true crime as narratives that are best understood as the story of real events, shaped by the teller and imbued with their values and their beliefs about such events. Narratives can be textual, says Murley, they can be visual, aural, or a mixture of all three. Murley was writing in 2009, and I'll link her book in the show notes, and you'll be hearing a lot from Murley over this series. She rightly says that non-fiction murder narratives deserve greater scholarly attention, and she says this is because of the ways that they've informed culture and even how crime is reported. What I'm interested in, and why we're here on the Murder Media podcast, is exploring contemporary stories about murder and serial killers as various cases are told and retold across media. How do different media industry conditions and production practices and techniques, how do they impact the telling of these stories? We'll track cases across media, examining different technical affordances, looking at different economic models, what are the different cultural expectations of different kinds of crime media, and we'll think about different participatory practices. We'll consider the stories as they're represented, as they're retold, and as they're reproduced. And as they are in a kind of dialogue and conversation with each other, we'll look at how they create a matrix or an ecology of murder media. The Murder Media podcast is accompanying my broader murder media project. So far, the project has chapters in 2 edited collections, linked in the show notes, and an article in Popular Communications Journal, and a number of conference papers. It's my intention that the project will culminate in a book, some more publications, maybe some events at the university, and just generally more stuff as we go along. So there's lots to come, I have loads of ideas, and there's loads of things that I just need to talk about, which is why I've started the podcast. Murder Media will explore true crime media from an industrial perspective and will use critical approaches from adaptation frameworks. So what does that mean? It basically means that I'm taking a close look at how stories of murder and serial killers develop across media platforms. And in doing this, Murder Media will shift debates around this content away from celebrity, ethical or psychological paradigms. We'll explore the utilisation of genre. We'll look at various media platform sensibilities and production practices. We'll consider documentary modes or conventions of horror, serialisation, and how does true crime lean into procedural drama. We'll look at ideas around remaking and remixing. We'll look at the practices of social and digital media and the use of comedy and the inherent freedoms away from legacy media. We'll track cases across media as the podcast charts the research and writing of the Murder Media book. So you get to come with me as I research and write another book, and you'll get to witness my inevitable emotional breakdown as I try and go through that process. We'll also review and discuss true crime content as it drops, and we'll also be having some special guests here on the Murder Media podcast. So thinking of true crime content, this week Netflix announced that the new Monster series done by Ryan Murphy is going to be about the Menendez brothers. So the first series is about Dahmer, the second one is going to be about the Menendez case. And I'm not sure how that case will fill, an 8-episode series? Because the Dahmer series had a lot to go on. His childhood, the jogger, the mannequin, all those things. Is there enough content in the Menendez case? We'll see. We've already seen that true crime has been around for centuries, and we know that it is a multi-platform genre. So let's have a brief look at these murder media forms. Murder media can present as complex serialisation or dramatisation on television, both regular traditional broadcast TV like ITV or the BBC here in the UK, or NBC or Fox in the United States. And then of course it's on your video on demand streaming services like Netflix or premium subscription channels like HBO. These are shows like those already mentioned, Dahmer Monster on Netflix, The Long Shadow on ITV or The Act on Hulu. From my early research on these TV serialisations, or dramatisations if you want, of true crime cases, there's quite a clear distinction between the UK and the US ones. In the UK, ITV makes loads of these crime dramatisations, and I mean loads. And I mean the ones that they got the title card at the start, based on a true story. You know the ones like The Long Shadow, The Pembrokeshire Murders, Des. I don't mean the fictional ones like Broadchurch, I mean the ones based on real cases. Let's have a listen to the trailer for Des.
Just take your time. Take us through it again.
So we're talking about one body or two?
15 or 16.
I mean, this whole thing needs to put a leaf together from McGinnis. It's always been to Nelson's scripts. He planned this.
You have now charged a man by the name of Dennis Nilsson with murder.
Confirmed that Dennis Andrew Nielsen has been charged with the first of what is said to be multiple murders.
With lots of them coming from being commissioned or produced by ITV, they've got a very definite style and aesthetic. The colours are really washed out. There's a blue, sometimes blue-green filter on it. It looks cold and bleak, with a pale British cast sighing in a pale British police station. And the big difference that I'm finding so far, and this should and will change as I explore this further, is the lack of murder. There are few to none explicit scenes of violence. Now, it's implied, it's there, of course, from what we can infer, how the characters react to things, what the characters talk about, what the characters say, describe in a police interview. But Even when telling a tale as gruesome as Dennis Nielsen and his wardrobe packed with bin bags full of bodies, that visceral, visual gut punch it's just not there. Now, I'm not saying that it needs to be there, of course it doesn't, that's just one way of telling a story. In Des, having Daniel Mays looking glum as he dons a mask to cope with the stench of decay in Nielsen's flat tells us all we need to know about the horror of that situation. But it serves to highlight the difference between an ITV dramatisation of a grisly case of a serial killer keeping body parts in his flat when we compare it to a dramatisation of a case in America of a serial killer keeping body parts in his flat, which bears a striking resemblance to Nielsen. And I of course mean our old pal, Dahmer.
Excuse me. Jeff. I gotta say, that smell is worse than ever. I saw you go out to the dumpster and throw out a whole bunch of bad meat, so the smell should be gone by now. Jeff.
Ryan Murphy, after finishing out his contract with FX, came over to Netflix in a 5-year agreement to make a stack of content there. And he did. He made The Politician, Hollywood, Ratched, and then Murphy made Dahmer Monster, the Jeffrey Dahmer story. Now that's quite a mouthful, so I'm going to call it Dahmer Monster from now on, so you know that I mean this Netflix series and not the 2002 film called Dahmer, starring Jeremy Renner as our friend Jeff, which I'll get to in a future episode. With Dahmer Monster then, Murphy folds the case into his screen horror universe of fact and fantasy. American Horror Story, Murphy's long-running horror anthology on FX, features recurring cast members that links the series together. So this cast links the series as much as Murphy's aesthetic, as much as his own brand of horror. And his brand of horror is campy, excessive, gory and grotesque. One of the key things that was fun about American Horror Story is that cast and seeing those cast members again playing a different role each time. So Sarah Paulson, Emma Roberts, Lily Rabe, and of course, Evan Peters. Murphy could not bring American Horror Story with him to Netflix, it belongs to FX, but he could bring his style and he could bring one of his key actors, Evan Peters. Peters has played multiple roles in American Horror Story, and the excess of Dahmer Monster, with its aesthetic, style and Murphy's just stylisation really, retells the case, but with no new facts. Now, this is probably because there are no more new facts to learn about the Dahmer case. We know pretty much everything about it, what he did, where he did it, how he did it. Dahmer himself gave a really in-depth interview, the famous Stone Phillips interview, which is available on YouTube to see. Many people have written about it. His father wrote a book called A Father's Story. But what the series has instead is an abundance of horror sequences, really explicit scenes, loads of blood, loads of bodies, and an eerie dread that underpins the whole series. Dahmer Monster feels very much like an American Horror Story series. And there's nothing wrong with that. I love an American Horror Story. I think the only one I didn't really get on with was Roanoke. I didn't finish the summer camp, the 80s one either, the slasher one, 1984. I couldn't get on with that either. But I do love an American Horror Story. And Dahmer Monster feels very much like I'm in that world. In that world, in the American Horror Story world, Ryan Murphy has engaged with real-life murderers and real-life serial killers on many an occasion. In Coven, we've got the Axeman, a real murderer. We've got Madame Delphine Lalaurie, she tortured slaves. We've got the Devil's Night episode in Hotel, where we have a Dahmer in there. We've got Ramirez, we've got Gacy. I think the Zodiac makes an appearance. Eileen Warnos is there. There's another version of Gacy in Twisty the Clown, and so on and so forth. And Ramirez actually appears again, doesn't he, in 1984. So Ryan Murphy is engaged with real people, real murderers and real serial killers throughout American Horror Story. And because he has such a definite style, even though in Dahmer Monster he's telling a real story, and it is, title card based on true events, it still feels very much like an American Horror Story thing. So it kind of merges the two together. We'll look at this in more detail in a few episodes' time when we talk about dramatisations in more depth. We find murder media on film. Really long films like Zodiac is a good film, but I don't know, watch it in 2 parts, I reckon. to more modern takes like My Friend Dharma, which is adapted from the comic of the same name. Now, this comic was illustrated and written by Durf McDurf, who went to school with Jeff, so that's a really interesting insight into that portion of Jeff's life, those years at high school. So we've got films like that, like Zodiac, My Friend Dharma, etc. But without getting into this too much, I'm going to have to get into it a little bit, film has traditionally been more violent or gory and horrifying than TV. Now, of course, in recent years, that things have changed with TV becoming, for want of a better word, I mean, it's not the best word, but TV has become more cinematic. TV now has the violence and the gore and the blood that cinema has, and nowhere is this more clear than with particular genres on TV. So horror, for example. Yep, TV horror, again, it's all linked. When shows like The Walking Dead and American Horror Story leaned into explicit horror scenes, and more channels and services leaned into giving showrunners, almost complete creative freedom, basically telly got gory. So go and read my Rethinking horror book for more on this. Now, before the cycle of TV horror that I wrote about and cried over, TV drama was just not as gory, be it a horror drama, a true crime drama, a science fiction drama, or whatever. There were outliers for sure, but as TV began to change in the late 90s and early 2000s, the rise of streaming services, the rise of the internet, audience fragmentation, all these things meant that telly had to do more. And it did. It got more visually rich. So with the rest of TV dramatisations changing and becoming more explicit, so did the true crime dramatisation. Now we can look at the more contemporary ones and see them, in America anyway, really leaning into this cinematic visual feast that television has become. So like the aforementioned Dharma Monster, there's some really strong sequences in that series. And then in others like The Staircase, where we see Kathleen Peterson die horribly 3 times. Now, if you know about the case, you know that there were 3 theories put forward as to how Kathleen died. 1, she just had an accident and fell on the stairs. 2, Peterson murdered her. And 3, she was outside, she got attacked by an owl, her head was all sliced up on the back because of the owl's, they're not claws, are they? Talons. And she ran in the house and, she was all bloodied and she fell on the stairs because of that. Now, in the Staircase dramatisation, these 3 theories are played out for us. They're shown to us in very explicit, painful, I think, detail. And, Toni Collette plays Kathleen. Toni Collette is incredible, as always. But these 3 murder or death sequences are really quite tough to watch. So before all this, before these changes in television that came off the back of the cycle of TV horror, before all this, true crime or, murder media fans, if you wanted a more grisly, graphic depiction of murder and violence, you found it in film, not on television. So these true crime films, or these dramatised versions of true crime on film, some of them are just straight up hybrids with horror. So Ed Gein, the Butcher of Plainfield, tells the story, well, no, actually it doesn't tell the story at all. It doesn't tell the story of Ed Gein. It's a film that has a very loose base on Ed Gein, but for the most part, the film is just a slasher. They even had the guy who was under the mask playing Jason Voorhees, Kane Hodder is his name, play Ed Gein in this movie. Now, he's a big guy. I don't know if you remember Friday the 13th at all, if you remember Jason. Jason, was not a little dude. So Ed Gein, though, as we know in the real world, he was not a hulking, violent, stalking hunter-killer. He was more of an opportunist. He did prefer to dig 'em up rather than kill 'em. In this film, in The Butcher of Plainfield, Gein is a local super monster and he is hyper-violent. The opening scenes feel very much like outtakes from a Saw movie, and Gein tortures his victims like a chatty Leatherface.
We all thought that Ed Gein was a strange guy.
Haven't you had enough dissecting these bodies?
Bodies are just empty vessels. Ain't got no souls.
No!
Don't you talk to me like that, boy.
I'm sorry, Mama.
You better watch yourself, Ed.
We've got murder media documentaries from genre-defining icons like The Thin Blue Line to intimate portraits like Eileen, Life and Death of a Serial Killer. Then we've got the contemporary murder according to Netflix documentaries like Conversations with a Killer, with 3 series of that, one on Bundy, one on Gacy, one on Dahmer. Now these miniseries have a formula that presents the words of the killer as naked truth. The key narrators in these tape series are the killer themselves, making the accounts somewhat unreliable, I think. Certainly in the case of John Wayne Gacy, who, even on the way to the death chamber, was still claiming that he was innocent with what was it, John? 23 bodies in the crawl space of your gaff? Come on. Now again, I'll cover these in more detail in a future episode. Still thinking about documentary, we've got the more reserved, yet seething with anger, British crime story documentary series. One covers Harold Shipman and one covers Peter Sutcliffe. But again, both of these look around the killer, at the context and the conditions of serial murder. We're not looking at what Peter Sutcliffe's childhood was like. We're not looking at how Harold Shipman was when he was a kid. Instead, both of these series, these documentary series, do really valuable cultural work. The Shipman one looks at how elderly people were neglected to the point of Shipman being able to kill in the hundreds. Nobody cared enough. And in the Sutcliffe one, it does a fantastic job of unpacking the deep-seated misogyny that ran through 1970s England and how this in turn drove the investigation. I say investigation, the Ripper Squad were useless, and investigation is too grand a word for their incompetence. But the documentary does hear the women involved, survivors, family members, women who were appalled at the handling of the case and the blame being laid at the feet of those that were killed and attacked. Stay home, the women were told. You were under curfew. Now, the documentary contains some really incredible and quite moving footage, I think, from the Take Back the Night marches. It's really powerful stuff.
My God.
Any woman was at risk.
This murder changed everything.
The anger was now at boiling point.
5 years is too long. If they haven't caught him yet, I don't think they ever will.
He had successfully hoodwinked an entire police force.
The police were actually excluding evidence.
You cannot conceive of what it was like.
I'm the robber. I thought they will never catch him. Never. Ever. He controlled us all.
He was the last person in the world that you'd have suspected.
In recent years, true crime has grown on the newer forms of media, on social media and digital media. Social media accounts, Reddit threads and wiki forums have all proven themselves spaces for true crime. Each social media platform has its own rules or practices, and this in turn develops its own modes of true crime presentation. For example, on Instagram, users engage in like-seeking behaviour and self-presentation and self-promotion. Commenters on posts that detail some of the most famous murderers somehow find a way to insert themselves into the narrative. It's all about the me over on Instagram. And commenters will link themselves, however tenuously, and it's really tenuous, to the case. So we'll get to that in more detail in a later episode. Interestingly, social media, despite its very public nature, offers what we might call a safe space to proclaim love for a favourite serial killer. Bethan Jones explores the notion of dark fandoms, where enjoyment of dark material might be kept in the, dark. Users commenting on social media that say Dahmer is their favourite serial killer brings such thing into the light, into a safe space. So in these safe spaces, in these comment sections on, true crime accounts or accounts that accompany a podcast, it's okay to proclaim, it's okay to proclaim a love for Dahmer. In this comment section where everyone else there, where they all feel the same, you're not going to be ostracised or told that there's something wrong with you if you say that thing in this comment section. Digital media gave us platforms where people can produce and upload their own material. The Murder Media Project is going to look at two key spaces here, podcasting and YouTube. Podcasting really came of age in 2015 when Apple integrated podcast support on the default interfaces of your iPhones and your iPads. Podcasts represent a revival of grassroots media, and they're a really important and interesting alternative to legacy media. And for true crime, podcasts allow for explorations of true crime with approaches and voices that have been largely ignored. Now, freedoms from media regulation, low barriers to entry, just look at me, give the true crime podcast a mode of reflection on murder cases that you're just not going to get on mainstream or legacy media. Now, I'm kind of thinking here, and maybe I'll find more of this as we go on, or I'll be able to unpack this a little bit more. When you've got all these podcasts exploding onto the scene in 2015 that are talking about true crime, that are presenting new voices, bringing new approaches, a few years after that, legacy media seems to respond, and then that's when we start getting the ACT, DES, things like this, that have this different perspective. Before, the mid-2010s, before around 2015, true crime documentaries, true crime series over on legacy media, there's some quite sturdy formats going on. You just look at like Lifetime movies, or you can look at, some of the, I don't want to use the word trashy, but some of the more cheaper true crime series that are all about, detailing how the murders took place. We're just talking about the serial killer. Did he wet the bed? Was he mean to animals? Did he like to set things on fire? Did he have an alcoholic father, an overbearing mother? All those things. Was he bullied as a child? Blah, blah, blah. All those things. And it's just all about him, all about the serial killer, all about what he does. It's all about when we do find the body of, quite often than not a woman, her body just becomes a site to find out more information about the male serial killer. The legacy media content starts to change as we enter and start getting close to the year 2020. And I'm wondering if that's in response to the growth of true crime podcasts and people, the listeners, responding and enjoying podcasts that came at it from another angle. What do you think? Do you think there's something in that? We'll see as I go along. Now, of course, I can't mention true crime podcasts without mentioning Serial. Now, there we go. I've mentioned it. Serial. I won't be talking about it again. There's plenty of really excellent scholarship out there on Serial. Do go and have a look if you're interested. Lindsay Sherrill, in particular, has done some very good stuff on Serial. I'm more interested in the podcast that revisit some of the bigger hitters, solved crimes, the bigger names, the heavy hitters of the serial killer and murder, canon, and how they approach retelling and representing these stories. So I'm not interested in finding out more details about what these serial killers did. We know all the details. I'm interested in how the stories are told. So in particular, what happens when, say, the story of what Dahmer did, or what the Unabomber was after, or how Nielsen got away with his crimes? What happens when these stories collide with comedy and improvisation in podcasts like All Killer No Filler or The Last Podcast on the Left? Away from legacy media, these podcasts can roast serial killers and murderers. They undermine them. They take away their celebrity status. And I think it was one of the Last Podcast fellas who, in an interview with, I should remember this, I think it was in the Atlantic, they were talking about how through their approach to talking about serial murder in this way, they are defanging the monster. Over on YouTube, true crime has collided with another form, with makeup tutorials. It might seem that these two things, murder and mascara, are worlds apart. I reckon they actually slot perfectly well together. Now, the makeup video is under-examined, of course, due to its perceived frivolity and being inherently gendered feminine. But then, so is true crime. Despite true crime's contemporary origins being traced back to the misogynistic True Detective magazines, true crime is also gendered feminine. The primary audience for true crime is largely women, and despite views on gender and cosmetics evolving to be more inclusive, makeup is largely an interest and activity for women. So when we think about it that way, of course the two forms would work well together. It's fascinating, I think anyway, to observe in these makeup and true crime videos from the likes of, say, Bailey Sarian or Better Off Red, we've got a replacement of the violated female body that's torn, battered and bruised that we might see in a true crime documentary. It's been replaced with the pretty face of the beauty YouTuber. So she's applying makeup as a highly feminine act, and this is juxtaposed with the hyper-masculine acts of violence in the story. But, and I'm sorry to say this again, we'll get to that in a future episode. Let's draw some parameters then. Some parameters for the Murder Media podcast and the research journey that we're going to go on. True crime, as we can see, is a very broad spectrum, from the variety of crimes to its mix of storytelling and investigations, from the unsolved to the solved cases. Murder Media, then, is to focus on media texts that tell the story of murder, be it serial or single, and texts that tell the story of cases that are solved, with perpetrators that have been or are still incarcerated. I'll be looking at texts that retell the story of certain cases, so I can track how the story changes, how it is approached, how it's re-narrativized across media. I've already mentioned a few, but to hopefully encourage you to tune in to the rest, we're going to talk about The Murder Network, Mummy Dead and Dearest, The Jeffrey Dahmer Files, or Jeff as it's also known, Appropriate Adult, Manhunt the Unabomber, Sins of Our Mother, Capturing the Killer Nurse, No Man of God, Ed Gein, The Butcher Plainfield, I've already mentioned that one, but never mind, Cult Leader, Beyond Reasonable Doubt, Eleanor Neale, Kendall Ray, The Ripper, The Night Stalker, and Conversations with the Killer, the Ted Bundy tapes. And that's what we'll get into in episode 2 of the Murder Media podcast. Thank you so much for joining me. Please do listen to the next episode, which I'll release at the same time as this one. And please do follow Murder Media on Instagram, Facebook and Twitter, or with the same handle, MurderMedia81. Share this podcast with anyone you reckon would be interested, anyone who also likes to analyse and overthink true crime, and email or message me with any Murder Media stuff that you'd like me to talk about. And let's please carry on the conversation over on the socials. Goodbye.